on the air from Broadcast Center in Farmington Hills. Everything's working over there? Well, it's nice to be back with you guys together in person. We did have a bar mitzvah last week, so this was a really full room. We're going to be meeting this week or next week to talk about COVID safety. If you guys have opinions about that, can you let me know? We're going to be meeting to talk about COVID safety protocols at the temple at different kinds of programs, and I'm interested in what you guys think. So you know what our rules are now, and I'm just interested in what you think, and I'll relay it to the committee. I don't make these decisions at all. So, but I am asked. Sometimes they're interested in what I want to do, and sometimes they turn to people with more medical degrees than me. Have I what? Have I done my research? Arthur asked how we were going to get people to take this new pill that came out today. I said, we tell them it's ivermectin wrapped around hydroxychloroquine, and we're good to go. So, in any case, we are going to start for the sake of those who are watching us near and far, more far than near. And it's great to be back. We think we had a lovely holiday season. It wasn't exactly how we wanted it to go, but it was still lovely. And last week was a beautiful event. Thank you, Audrey, for putting that on with the Social Justice Committee. It was great to be out by our sukkah. And while I know there are a lot of people who are still nervous about coming to temple, I hope that people will realize that no matter what we decide with the COVID situation, we will be safe. We're going to begin with the first slide, Arthur. Where the world is dark with illness, let us kindle the light of healing. Where the world is bleak with suffering, let us kindle the light of caring. Where the world is dimmed by lies, let us kindle the light of truth. May we honor the lighting of this flame. May the honor of lighting this flame inspire us to acts of goodness that illumine all the world. May the mitzvah of kindling these Shabbat candles remind us to sanctify life with the power of light. I'd like to invite the foremans to come light the candles. As we do, mention those who will be participating tonight, in addition to Saul and Helen, are Judy Primack, Jean Claridge, Jerry Lieberman, Roberta Slade, Susie Friedman, and Diana Lieberman. Just a note for our readers as Judy comes up, you don't really need to adjust this. It's got a very wide base, so you can leave where it is. Yes, please.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Our ancestors hallowed the Sabbath day. In dark times, it was a refuge for them, and in times of prosperity, it gave them rest and joy. As a community, we celebrate the opportunity to gather in that spirit, even as we imagine Shabbat anew. May we too find rest from the day's work and refuge from our cares. May we too feel the warmth of love and companionship. May we too feel our joys heightened and our sorrows softened by the love we give and receive.
May we be blessed with Shabbat joy. May we be blessed with Shabbat peace. May we be blessed with Shabbat
Tonight, as we welcome Shabbat, we look to this moment in time to once again gain perspective on where we have been and where we are going. On this Shabbat, may we find the space to consider and to challenge. May we find the courage to do what is right. Together, let us find meaning, calm our anxieties, understand our purpose, and appreciate our accomplishments. Let us find the strength to continue working for ourselves and others. Let us share the burdens and blessings of responsibility. Let us locate the will to change the things we can no longer accept. Let us do all of this and more, mindful that we are a community of humanistic Jewish believers, unbroken and unbowed, prepared to face all that life has in store for us. Let us strive to feel these bonds of belief and community when we are together and when we are apart. Let us rejoice in our ties. Let us rejoice in our collective power. Let us rejoice in the gift of Shabbat.
At one with our forebears, we affirm that righteousness and enlightenment shall be our torch. We shall teach these values diligently to our children all the days of our lives. We shall endeavor to live by these values in the comfort of our homes or on cold and wind-swept roads, whether adversity bows our heads or fulfillment makes our spirit soar. Our hands shall mete out justice to all, and our eyes shall be open to the light of truth. We shall emblazon our paths through life with this light as a beacon for all humankind.
Transforming power of love, the redeeming power of compassion, the healing power of forgiveness, these endure in every age.
the joy which comes from sharing, the strength which comes from striving, the nourishment which comes from nature, these endure in every age. The sanctity of life, the value of truth, the primacy of justice, these endure in every age. Amidst never-ending change, may we have the wisdom to know and to cherish those teachings which endure for all time.
If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart.
In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. I don't seem to have my list tonight of the people that were on our list, but I believe Julie Eliason, Karen Tremper Harris, Joe Gaydon, and I think that was the list. If there's someone whom you're thinking about whose name you'd like to add, we'll start over here. Anyone? Anybody on this side? Yes, Sandy. And Diana. Sandy Landau, thank you. She broke her femur, but she should be fine. She had a successful surgery. Is there anyone that we missed? May all who suffer know that they are not alone. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies, and the renewal of their spirits.
I lost your voice. I lost your timbre, your cadence, your accent. I lost your voice. I had it the first month. I had it the first year. Then it faded. Then it was gone. I lost your voice. I can't hear it anymore. I lost your voice, but not your words. Your words of approval, your words of wisdom, your words of support, of love, of guidance. I lost your voice, but I'll always have your words. Arthur Lee Pupper.
Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those we have taken into our hearts with our own. This week, our community continues to mourn the recent death of John Zimmer. We also mourn the recent death of Diana's cousin, Carolyn Bush, and we extend condolences to our friend Jamie Hines, watching us from Scotland right now, on the death of his cousin, John L. Thomas. We have a long list of yard sites tonight since we were primarily off on Friday nights. They include Molly Avery, Betty Becker, Harry Borovitz, Sidney Bowman, William W. Brown, Ed Shalom, Armand Creed, Ruth Davis, Gertrude Ernst, Mary Feldman, Etta Bell Fieldman, Edith S. Fox, Alan Freund, Lillian Gilman, Archie Green, Louis Haas, George Harris, Jerry Hooker, Maurice Jacobs, Violet Jacobs, George Jarris, Phyllis Keller, Mary Clarich, Audrey Robinson Klein, Cindy Klein, Catherine Kozak, Audrey Crone, Victor Kuffler, David Leitner, Sam Lieberman, Norma Leibowitz, Scott Lipton, Belle Matthews, Goad Medier, Harold Metler, William Morris, Charlotte Nelson, Dora Nissenbaum, Kalman Nissenbaum, Dorothy Nolish, Fred Nolish, Sally Paul, Ann Surratt, Benjamin Sherbin, Jerry Sherbin, Alan Seifer, Herschel Stewart, Donald Sugarman, Helen Sugarman, Robert Voigt, Lillian Warren, Gerald Primack, Nathan Priss, Sam Remnick, Gerald Ross, Kurt Weinberg, Jamie Winchell, and Joseph Winchell. We say, Yehi Zichron Livracha, may their memory be for blessing. May the memories of those who have gone provide us with at least some small measure of comfort as we face our lives in their absence. If you can do so comfortably, please rise for a humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. And we read together, Nit Gadal v'nit Kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. So we are actually tonight celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, Jewish style, and we're going to begin with some special music that Ezra will tell us about.
A song in Ladino, also known as Judeo-Spanish, by the First Lady of Sephardic song, Flori Jagoda. The lyrics are, "Where is the key that was in the drawer? My forefathers brought it with great pain from their house in Spain, dreams of Spain. Where is the key that was in the drawer? My forefathers brought it with great love. They told their sons, this is the heart of our home in Spain, dreams of Spain." Donde está la llave que estaba en cajón? ¿Dónde está la llave que estaba en cajón? Mis nonos la trujeron con grande dolor de su casa de España, de España, de su casa de España, de España. Está la llave que estaba en cajón, mis nonos la trujeron con grande amor, dijeron a los fillos, esto es el corazón de nuestra casa de España, de España, nuestra casa de España, de España.
That was very lovely, thank you, and a great way to introduce our topic tonight. So we're going to just spend a little bit of time talking about a topic that you could spend a lifetime studying. So I'm only going to give you just a few highlights and unfortunately also some lowlights of the legacy of Sephardic Jewry. So let's talk about first the name, Sepharad, Sephardic. Where does that come from? There are only a few places in the Bible that are mentioned outside the land of Israel that we don't know what they were talking about. And one of them is Sepharad. We're not sure what they meant. It seems to have been some kind of northern area, but in any case, over time, it was associated with Spain. And to this day, in modern Hebrew, Sepharad is the name for Spain. In Roman times, it became identified with the Iberian Peninsula, and ever since then, we've used that name. We have evidence of Spanish Jews as early as the 2nd century CE, so about 1800 years ago, living in central Spain, but not of any kind of organized community per se. Jewish immigration to Spain seems to have come right around the time that the Moors arrived. The Moors being North African Muslims who brought with them all of the Muslim culture that had begun to spread, very heavily Arabized, I should say, Muslim culture, that had begun to spread all across the world, first by Muhammad and then by his followers. Now, the Jews who lived there lived under what was called a dhimmi system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. But this dhimmi system did not prevent them, for a variety of reasons, from becoming more or less, as well as you possibly could in those early medieval days, integrated with the larger society that was being built there by the Muslims. So dhimmi, essentially, for our purposes, refers to people of the book, primarily Christians and Jews. It's the term for non-Muslims who are living with a certain kind of legal protection. It refers to the state's obligations to them, because of course there was no secular society, right? And it refers to their rights as well and their obligations to the state. So for instance, when Muslims paid a certain tax to the mosques and to the religious enterprise there, the dhimmi had to as well. They had to pay what was called a jizya tax, which helped to promote both their own community and presumably also the larger needs of the community. But it also exempted them from certain kinds of things. They had to distinguish themselves from their neighbors in dress. And this, of course, varied with the time period as well. They had to wear, in some periods, a yellow badge. This was not quite the sense of yellow badge that we think about it from Nazi Germany. It was a way of showing that they belonged to this community and not that community. There were different headdresses that were involved at certain times as well. Now, there were restrictions. They weren't allowed to build new synagogues. They could convert existing buildings into churches and to synagogues, but they could only repair them. They couldn't build anything new. A Muslim man was allowed to marry a Jewish or a Christian woman, and he could keep his religion, but a Muslim woman could not marry a dhimmi man unless, of course, he ceased to be a dhimmi man and converted to Islam. A lot of this was codified in what was called the Pact of Omar. That was really a pact between Christian conquered groups and Muslims. And it doesn't specifically mention Jews, but obviously Jews came under it once the Jews arrived or became more prevalent in these Muslim areas. So from the time of the Moorish conquest in the 800s to the time when Christianity, Catholicism really, reconquered Iberian Spain, the Jews lived in the areas that the Muslims continue to run, and with significant exceptions that I'll talk about in a moment, they lived more or less at peace. But all this time, there was the pressure of what was known as the Reconquista, which was the reconquest, one of the greatest aims of medieval Christendom, going almost into the early modern era, of all of the things that they wanted to accomplish. Even when they were fighting on the other side of the continent with the Ottomans, they were assiduous in their determination to get the Iberian Peninsula back under Christendom. And of course, we know that happened. It happened in 1492. While we were busy in school, I know I was, learning about how Columbus, no great hero, sailed the ocean blue. What was really important to our history as Jews is that the Jews were getting tossed into the ocean blue, not literally, but figuratively, under the reunification of Spain that took place when Castile and Aragon, Ferdinand and Isabella's territory, were reunited, and ultimately Granada was captured. Portugal had become its own independent kingdom previously, and that was around the mid-12th century. But along the way, until the Reconquista was complete, and with, I will mention a few hiccups, the Moors and the Jews got along fairly well. And there were all kinds of reasons for that I'll talk about. We call this the Golden Age of Jewish Spain. Now, when I talk about hiccups, it wasn't all clean. There were invasions of, well, one in particular, of Berbers from North Africa, who were sort of today's version of the Taliban, or yesterday's version of the Taliban. They were called the Almohads, which meant the unifiers, and they were very, very strict Muslims. Everything had to be done according to their way of understanding Islam. But we're not going to talk too much about that, except when we have to mention Jews fleeing here and there. Rather, we're going to talk about this Golden Age. Now, again, we call it a Golden Age, and I've emphasized how well the Jews and the Muslims, the Moorish Muslims at any rate, were getting along. And that was very true, particularly when compared to the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe, with a few significant exceptions, but certainly at this time, in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, really going into the 13th century, was a nightmare for Jews. There were certainly some areas where Jews flourished. The Ashkenazic population was rather small, I should mention. It only grows later when Jews, after being expelled from all the best places, France, parts of Germany, England, significantly one of the first major expulsions, only after that, and they head east towards Poland and that area, only then does Ashkenazic Jewry really grow. At this point, the centers of Jewish life are decreasingly, but still very importantly, the Mesopotamian region, Babylon, where the Gaonic Jewish flourishing is kind of coming to its end. This is after the period when the Talmud was written, but there's still a substantial Jewish community. They're now becoming, again, due to the Muslim conquest, very Arabized in their culture. When we talk about Arabized, we mean culture from the Saudi Peninsula, the Arabian area. They came up out of there and conquered all these lands up through Turkey and then all the way around North Africa, etc. But the stuff in Europe was horrible, and the worse that it, in Northern Europe, the worse that it got there, the better things looked where the Jews were living. Now, it's important to remember that this was not a secular paradise for Jews, because there were no secular paradises. There was a taste of what we might call secularism, but it's not really fair to compare it to what we think of today. It simply means non-religious art, poetry, and so forth. And the Jews got in on the action there too. According to Princeton professor Mark Cohen, who I read a little bit of his book just to give me a taste of what I learned years ago, the Jews were able, unlike again in Northern Europe, to work in a variety of different professions. They had a wide access compared to Northern Europe. In Northern Europe, you may recall from Jewish history or just general European history, there were guilds, and the guilds restricted Jewish participation. Now, this wasn't universal, it wasn't everywhere, and it wasn't all at one time. But it was enough to make life miserable for them at very long stretches. So, for instance, we know that Rashi, who lived in the 11th century, was able to be a vintner, but within a couple generations, especially with the Crusades and everything that happened as a result of the First and Second Crusades, that privilege disappeared, and Jews took on rough times in terms of their occupations. I don't want to get too much into it, but you know, money lending was a big part of it. Running taverns later becomes another one. But in Spain, Jews were craftsmen, pharmacists, physicians, textile makers, glass makers, jewelry makers, retailers. They specialized in all kinds of products, sales and production of foodstuffs and long-distance commerce, and they worked in government from time to time. The Pact of Omar didn't permit that, but they had a strong pragmatic streak in Spain. And the Jews also benefited from this Arab culture, because Arab culture, as we know, and unfortunately our children are not taught in public schools very much, was very open to new learning. It was the translation of the classical Greek texts into Arabic that really created what was the first Renaissance. Not the Northern European and not the other Southern European Renaissance in Italy, but the real first Renaissance, the Arab Renaissance, the Muslim Renaissance. Their familiarity with Arabic was easy because having spoken Aramaic and having a very clear understanding of Hebrew, these are cognate Western Semitic languages. And if you, for instance, have studied Spanish, you might have noticed it's easier to learn than, say, Chinese or Japanese, right? Well, Arabic is not as difficult to learn for a Hebrew or Aramaic speaker as Chinese or Japanese would be for us or for them, I guess, for that matter. Coming out of the Fertile Crescent, as many of them did along with other Arabs, into the heartland of this new Islamic empire, they found themselves in the middle also of an Arabic or an Arab science revolution, medical revolution, and philosophical revolution. And that was very important. And the Christians who lived there benefited from it as well. So there was a kind of a natural coexistence that took place between the Jews of Spain, really the Jews of all the Arabic provinces, all Jews who were part of those domains. And it led the Jews to adopt philosophy and science and medicine and really to develop those arts and sciences right alongside this Arab Islamic Renaissance. The Bible was quickly translated into Arabic. It's not one of their holy texts, but it's a respected and considered to be a divine work. Hebrew began to become the subject of rigorous grammatical study, the way that Arabic was as well. And so it led to a revolution in how they interpreted the Bible, recovering old words, language comparisons, word histories, philology we call it. And this was really very, very important to the development of all Jewish commentaries. To this day, while European commentators, Northern European commentators remain very important, some of the ones that are the most beloved come from Spain and the Sephardic milieu. Nearly everything the Jews wrote, they wrote in Arabic, and that includes Maimonides. I'll talk about him in just a few moments. And it meant that they had to borrow whole swaths of vocabulary from the Arabs or from Arabic, which had originally created philosophical terms in Arabic that were based on Greek terms that Plato or Aristotle had used. I had in rabbinical school, just a little aside, my thesis was a translation of a Sephardic, in this case Italian, translation or a commentary on Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, right? And it was a Neo-Aristotelian translation. All of the Neo-Aristotelian concepts, the philosophical concepts, were in normal Hebrew words, but the way that they were put together in much the way that we would use the word form to mean one thing in normal everyday English, but if you saw the word form in a Platonic discourse, you would have an entirely different way of understanding it, right? Well, they had done that too, and I was clueless. It turned out there had been somebody who had written a dictionary, never published, of all these terms. It saved my can. We went down into the bowels of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and in a stack of those old mimeograph, leftovers from professors long gone, we found this dictionary. It had actually been written by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was one of the most important theologians of the conservative movement. He was saved by HUC during the Holocaust, and the minute he could get out of there, he said, "Thank you for saving my life. I'm leaving and going to New York where I can wear tefillin and daven, because you're not doing that here in Cincinnati for sure." So I got the one really cool legacy of Abraham Joshua Heschel that nobody knows about. It was sitting in a basement in Cincinnati, but it was really a legacy of Sephardic Jewry, because what he had done, what the Jews had done, was to take these Arabic terms, translate them to Hebrew, and then Heschel had gone through and methodically put them into philosophical language. I want to talk now about some famous people who lived back then. And obviously there were hundreds and even thousands of significant individuals, but I picked really kind of the top 5, 6 people to share with you a little bit about their life in chronological order. You can see how they were affected by the events and a few things that they did, and I'll even share some of their poetry where it's appropriate. So the first fellow I want to talk about was a guy that we today call Shmuel Nageed, which is sort of Shmuel the officiant, or the governor even, you might translate it. But his real name was Shmuel ibn Nachrila, and you hear the Arabic influence even in his name. He was born in the late 10th century, around 990, died around the middle of the 11th century, 1056. He was a Talmud scholar, a grammarian and philologist, and an influential poet, and I think I did definitely get a couple poems here from him. But interestingly, he was also a soldier, and from soldiering, a merchant, and a politician. His poetry was so well known that he became as famous for his poetry among Muslims and Jews as he was for his political involvement, which again, though people did it, it wasn't that common. He worked, because of the Almohad invasion, he had made his way from Cordova to Moorish Granada. And I know some of you have been to Spain and seen these places. I have not had that privilege, maybe one day. And even though it was technically forbidden by the Pact of Omar, he was so trusted and so talented as a leader that the king gave him charge of political and military affairs, and he flourished. He wound up even bequeathing the position to his son. I want to read to you one of his poems. Now, this is an example of Spanish, medieval Spanish, secular poetry, if you will. There's not a very strong religious element in this. These poems were frequently read at lavish dinners of wine and good food and spices, and really something that had traveled over the Mediterranean from ancient Rome. And you know, what were you going to do? Put on the TV, watch, listen to the radio? No, this is how people entertained each other. They sang songs and they read poems that they wrote. My friend, tell me, when shall I pour you my wine? The cry of the cock woke me, and sleep has deserted my eyes. Come out and see the morning light, like a scarlet thread in the east. Make haste, give me a cup before the dawn starts to rise, of spiced pomegranate juice from the perfumed hand of a girl who will sing songs. My soul revives and then dies. So this is a story about a guy stayed up all night getting drunk, is what it is. But it's also a very beautiful poem and very typical of these Spanish secular, if you will, poems, these wine poems as we were taught. The next fellow that I want to introduce you to is a favorite of mine and many in the rabbinical business, Yehuda Halevi. He was born in 1075 in Tudela. He died in Egypt. And just from his biography, you know that he was unfortunately fleeing intolerant Muslims. And that was part of the fact of life, because this golden age did not last long, and it didn't go on in many places for very long at all. He was a religious philosopher, a very important one, and of course a poet. The Jews loved, especially the ones that I'm presenting you with, they loved writing poetry, both secular and religious, and some of them are still in prayer books. His works were the culmination, if you will, of the development of Hebrew poetry inspired by Arab. So he was actually, turning the page, I'm reminded, it was not just the Almohads. He was running from both the Reconquista and the Almohads. So he had Christians and Muslims on his tail. And ultimately was chased away and made his way, legend says, to Israel, but as far as we know, there's no actual substantiation to that. He's said to have died in Israel, but I think history shows he died in Egypt. He wrote a poem that is considered a proto-Zionist poem that's very important to people who are Zionists today, and really, I think, one of the most beautiful poems of religious longing that I've ever heard. My heart is in the east, and I in the uttermost west. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds while yet Zion, Israel, lies beneath the fetter of Edom. Edom being ancient enemy of the Jews, the Israelites, but now associated with the Arab world. Yet Zion lieth beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains. He's not really in chains, but he is in the diaspora. A light thing would it seem for me to leave all the good things of Spain, seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary. He wants to go to the wall. That's what he's talking about, the temple. And this, of course, written before then. The legend was that he did arrive at the wall or the Temple Mount at some point and was killed there. But again, I think that's legend. Some of his poems were very religious, this one being more sort of proto-nationalist. I'll just read a few from this beautiful poem that actually I think was in one of my prayer books growing up. Forget not the day of Shabbat. Its mention is like a pleasant offering. And there during it the dove found resting place, and there the weary may relax. The dove of Noah's Ark on Shabbat, he sang, rested there. The day is honored by the children of faith. Careful to observe it are fathers and sons, engraved upon 2 tablets of stone, from great power and mighty strength. And they all came in covenant together, in unison they said, we shall do, and we shall listen. This is a quote from when the Israelites received the Torah. They said, we shall do and we shall listen. And they commenced and answered, God is one. Blessed is he that gives strength to the weary. He spoke in his holiness by the mountain of more spice. Remember and guard the 7th day, and of all his commandments completed together, they strengthen the loins and gather up power. So there's more to it, but you get the sense of it. It's beautiful, it is evocative, it is far different than many of the earlier prayers, which are much drier and much more pleading. And that's why this style of prayer became so popular as insertions into traditional prayer books. When Orthodox Jews look at a Reform or Conservative prayer book, forget about ours, but when they look at a Conservative Reform prayer book and they see all this modern poetry inserted and they criticize it, these are people that are unaware that there was medieval and later poetry that was inserted into the prayer books that they're using today. It's one of the reasons that Orthodox services are so long, for instance, on the holidays, is all this poetry. Some of it's not nearly as beautiful as this, but in this particular case, when you have Yehuda Levy, you have beautiful poetry. And this one I have to share with you. This is my favorite secular poem of his. One day, I observed a gray hair in my head. I plucked it right out when it thus to me said, you may smile if you wish at your treatment of me, but a score of my friends soon will make a mockery of you. So, also filled with humor, and that's one of Yehuda Levy's poems as well. The last thing I want to mention was this book that he wrote that still seems for some reason to be very influential with a certain non-intellectual strain of Orthodox Jews. It's called Kuzari. It's actually written very beautifully. The premise of the book is that the mythical king of the Khazars, a Caucasian kingdom that legendarily, it might have happened in some small numbers, converted to Judaism. And Yehuda Levy imagines that the king of the Khazars has called representatives of the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims to plead their case for which monotheistic religion he should choose. And which does he choose? Judaism. And it's because of the wonderful argumentation presented to him, some of which is still quoted today, and it's kind of nonsense. But it made a lot of sense maybe 1,000 years ago. I'll give you one example, the Kuzari argument, that we know the Torah is true because unlike Islam, and this was the main argument, unlike Islam revealed to one man, Christianity revealed to one man, all the Jews who existed in the world at that moment were at Mount Sinai and received the Torah together. And because of this, it's a perfect revelation because they would check each other and make sure it was being remembered properly. There are enormous sections of the Bible alone that contradict this, and particularly when they returned from Babylon and they didn't know what half the holidays were that they were being told about, and it explicitly says, and they had forgotten this one, and they had forgotten that one. And of course, everything we know about eyewitnesses would go to show that we would have gotten about, if let's say there were 600,000 Jewish men there, we would have gotten 600,000, maybe 700,000 tourists from it. But you still find this online. This is the reason Judaism's true. I can't give that one as a big point to Yehuda Levy, except that the guy did make it onto the internet and is unfortunately obscuring some of his beautiful poetry with some of this misinformation. Anyway, let's move on. The next character I want to talk about is named Abraham ibn Ezra. He was also born in Tudela around 1090 and died in 1164. These are quite long lifespans if you think about all of the things they had to avoid. COVID was not around, but smallpox and pretty much everything else that could kill you. Ibn Ezra was an expert in astronomy. He understood very well the movement of the stars. He was also an astrologer, of course, of mathematics, of poetry again, a very important philologist, and in this case influential because he had wrote a very extensive commentary to the Torah, to other books in the Bible. Also a poet, I think I mentioned that. He also was the first of, and maybe it was the last for a while, of any of our important and still preserved commentators to allude to the hand of man, humanity, in the writing of the Torah. He calls this the great secret, about which if you know something, you should keep quiet. And it's really not that clear to those who don't know what he's talking about, but those who have ever read Spinoza, who will come along in the 17th century, and some of you have studied these passages with me, will remember that Spinoza decodes Ibn Ezra, where Ibn Ezra said, if you understand what I'm talking about, when I say that this contradiction is here and it points to something, he says, keep your mouth shut. The one who understands will remain silent. And so Spinoza just doesn't remain silent at all. And he's very loud about it, and it's the reason, as we'll see, that he gets into a little bit of trouble. Not tonight, we're not going to talk about it too much. I do want to read you just a small portion of Ibn Ezra's poetry. This one has a little bit of sexiness to it. It's also a little bit religious. So what does that say about their poetry and their worldview? They really didn't separate secular and religious realms. They were all one. Can my soul ever cool its passion to adhere to the life-giving rock? With him, wisdom's fountain abides, watering her grain and displaying her fruit. The stately shape of the soul in her glory resembles a bride bedecked with jewels. Every age retells God's praises, and the reborn nation will thank him. So the sexuality you can see here, and it's very reminiscent of the much more ancient Song of Songs in the Bible, but they were inspired by that. Okay, I think I have two more of these, and then we'll talk about what happened to them all. Moshe Ben Meiman. This guy is so important, he gets 3 different appellations. Moshe, son of Meiman, Moshe Ben Meiman. Rambam, which is the acronym that's made up of Rabbi Moshe Ben Meiman. You take the consonants together, throw some Oz underneath, and you get Rambam. Or the Greek, because he was a great philosopher, Maimonides, son of Meiman. He was born around 1138-39, died in 1204 in Egypt. And another important reminder of the fact that both the Reconquista and the Berbers were on their heels at many different times. In his case, it was the Almohads, very much so. He was born in Cordoba. He was, and continues to be, one of the foremost legal and philosophical Jewish thinkers of all time. And whether or not his philosophy has any relevance to our lives today, the study of it does. I remember when I first came here, when I was doing very complicated talks that were probably not appropriate for you guys. But I didn't know what to expect. What I remember about that was that I gave you 4 talks about 4 figures that I had on the wall of my office. Don't have those pictures there anymore because I got some better art. But I had on there Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. I had Spinoza, of course. I had Rabbi Wein, and I had Maimonides. Why? Not because I agree with him so much, but because Maimonides was one of the first and most important rationalists. He really believed that you could take Aristotelian, or what was then called, what we now call Neo-Aristotelian thought, kind of an updating of Aristotle, and that you could reconcile it with what the Bible said. Sort of like saying you could make science and the Bible's text work together, that they could both be saying the same thing or the same thing from different points of view. This is still something that many Orthodox Jews, traditional Christians, and others try to do. You know, there's young earth creationists. There's also old earth creationists. And some of them are Jews who say, well, the 6 days of creation represent the 6 eons of creation over billions of years. I mean, it's nonsense, but it's an attempt to get science and revelation, the Torah, to overlap as much as possible. Well, Maimonides started this to a very great extent. There had been some precursors back in the Greek days, but he started this to a very great extent for us now. He was also a prominent physician, and physicians at that time, remember, they didn't understand a lot of the things we know now. Neo-Aristotelians, of course, were still very much geocentrics. You know, they didn't even know that the sun wasn't going around the earth, and the moon and the stars and everything else. But he did have an extensive understanding of anatomy and things that you could do to help someone if it wasn't an infection, in which case, you know, goodbye, Charlie, you're probably going to die. But, you know, if you broke something, or if there was something that natural herbal medicine might help with, he was your man. There is speculation that the entire Meiman family converted forcibly, under duress, to Islam. And that's something that people don't talk about too much today. But we also know that they escaped when they could, and they escaped ultimately from Morocco. They went to Egypt, and that's where he became the court physician to the Ayyubids, which was the ruling family there in Fustat, which is now today is overshadowed by the larger Cairo. He knew all of the works that had been translated into Arabic. He knew Plato, he knew Aristotle, he knew all the Arabic philosophers. He wrote a book called The Guide to the Perplexed that is a philosophical work that is so obtuse as to be incomprehensible without special training. And he wrote it that way on purpose, because he knew he was going to get in trouble for this. And he did. People burned copies of it after his death. It was a big backlash to Maimonides. But he also wrote standard guides to Jewish behavior and Jewish law and standard compendiums, and really kind of revolutionized the whole work of doing that kind of thing, of having codes of Jewish law. As a result of his forced conversion, he also became influential in ultimately welcoming Jews who were forcibly converted to Islam and then later to Christianity back into the fold, because he developed an older rabbinical principle that said that even if a Jew sins, i.e. converts, he's still a Jew. And that meant that people did not have to reconvert, they just had to repent. And what it did in practice was allow people to come back into the Jewish world. So he's the ultimate rationalist. And the last fellow that I want to introduce you to very briefly is a guy named Moses de Leon. You probably have not heard of him. He lived from 1240 to 1305. He was really in the midst of the big Reconquista. We're getting very, very close to Islamic Spain disappearing in favor of Catholic Spain. And he goes the other way, to extreme mysticism, and writes a book that you've all heard of, even if you don't even know what's in it, called the Zohar. And he attributes it to a rabbi who lived about 900 years before him. And to this day, religious Jews think that that rabbi wrote it, which grammatically and in every other way is impossible. It is our modern day version of the Kabbalah. There's always been Jewish mysticism, but that one took over and was influential also on Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic Jews are mystical Jews. Not all Haredi Jews, not every Jew with a black coat And a beard is a Hasidic Jew, even if you think they are. But the ones that belong to a Hasidic group. Of course, in 1492, we wind up getting the expulsion. This is a result of Ferdinand and Isabel's reunification of the entire Iberian Peninsula, save for Portugal. And what happens? She, in approximately August of that year, timed it to Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, when the Jews mourn all of the horrible things that happened, including this now, but particularly the destruction of the two temples. She timed it to that. She said that either the Jews needed to convert to Christianity or they needed to leave. And I have the whole thing, it's called the Alhambra decree. I'm not going to read it because of, well, yeah, it's getting late, so I'm not going to read anything here, but it was extraordinarily restrictive. We don't know how many Jews left. We don't know how many Jews were there. One of the best scholars of Sephardic Jewry is a man whose last name you'll recognize, Netanyahu, because he was the father of the past prime minister. His name was Ben Sion Netanyahu, and he wrote kind of definitive book on the Jews of Spain, including teasing out what the numbers were. There were, we think, about 300,000 Jews. Then in a world that may have only had, less than 1.5 million or so Jews, that would have been a lot. Again, we don't know how many Jews there were in the world. We don't know how many Jews there were in Spain. There are no censuses. And we don't know how many left. Probably they dribbled out slowly. Probably a lot of them became very genuine, believing Christians. The Inquisition was aimed at these people who were now known as conversos. Some of the conversos were genuine, as I said. Some of them were what we call anusim, against their will. And the anusim sometimes had to pretend that they were Christians. The Jews became a very important topic, a target of the Intifada. The Inquisition, it might as well have been an Intifada for them, of the Inquisition. And it was to prove their true Christianity, that they weren't Judaizers. Ultimately, it was also the beginning of a sort of racialized anti-Semitism, not just religious, but persecution on the basis of the lack of limpieza de sangre, of purity of blood. In any case, many others went to Portugal. There, it was okay for a while, but it became worse. Jews who wanted to leave were forced to leave their children behind. Public spectacles like the auto de fe, which was public penance and punishment. These were like enormous kind of circusy things. Many who left went to Italy, notably to the Ottoman Empire. They kept Ladino alive there, Judeo-Spanish, which we just heard. Some went to Northern Africa, to the Mideast. Many went to areas controlled by the Netherlands, by the Dutch Republic. And that was notable because from that we get the Spinozas, the Espinosas as they were originally called. And some even went to the New World. To Recife, Brazil in particular, a small group went. And when Portugal took over that area once again, the entire community picked up and went to New Amsterdam, where they were greeted not with great friendliness from Peter Stuyvesant, but nonetheless, because of the Dutch East Indies Company, were welcomed, and they left their mark on the Jewish world. All right, I'm going to stop there and ask Ezra to lead us in our final song. And I don't have time for questions, and because I'm feeling a little dizzy right now. So I'm going to sit down. Okay, everybody, thank you.